All right, well, I didn't want to make this just your basic, typical rant against college football, the transfer portal, the NIL system. But yesterday, I did release a video talking about 5 teams I thought would be much improved in 2024. And one of them was Boise State. And lo and behold, look at what happens. Boise State's quarterback that helped lead them to winning the Mountain West, destroying UNLV, is in the transfer portal. Now, he might still come back, but this just goes to show you guys, and this is what we're seeing more and more of with this entire messed up ecosystem. It is the combination of death. That's what I call it. It is the NIL system, which is a complete joke. There's supposedly rules that no one is following. Players are getting millions and millions and millions of dollars, which I guess you could say is good for players. It's empowerment. But when rules are there and they're just constantly being broken, the system is a complete clown show. So nobody really knows what the rules are in terms of NIL. Not only do you have NIL involving recruiting with all the high 4 stars and the 5 stars and giving them contracts and deals before they sign with a university, but you also have NIL heavily impacting the transfer portal, and you're seeing these smaller teams like the Boise States, even like a team like Oklahoma, being a feeder school, if you will, to a bigger team, meaning you've got a quarterback at a smaller school who realizes he's probably not going to be a high draft pick, but if he goes into the portal, which is basically free agency, as a grad transfer, or it doesn't even have to be as a grad transfer. If you take a look at like Dylan Gabriel's career, you can transfer once after 2 years and then grad transfer 2 years later. It is a complete mess. And you want to know what also is hurting all of this? It is the extra pandemic year that they gave everyone. So now everyone has 1 extra year, and that's going to be happening for a few more seasons, I believe, until that runs out. But either way, this is just a complete mess. And the development that we're seeing within college football is feeder schools. And it's so sad to see. If you take a look at some of the top quarterbacks, Aiden Childs, I guess that's kind of a different situation with Oregon State, unfortunately not really being a Power 5 school anymore. You can kind of understand that. The Dante Moore situation is, well, that's a whole NIL deal in and of itself. He originally commits to Oregon. NIL, draws him to UCLA. Now he's into the portal. Cameron Ward, that's another one that you can say there's existential circumstances at play with Washington State not being a Power 5. Will Howard, that's just your typical Kansas State's not going to offer me, enough money in terms of NIL. I need to get my bag right now, considering I'm probably not going to be a high draft pick. It's understandable. I don't blame what these kids are doing, but the dynamics of this is so wrong for college football. Riley Leonard going from Duke very likely to Notre Dame, similar to Sam Hartman. Notre Dame using both Wake Forest and Duke as like developmental schools where it's like you develop the quarterback, you get him seasoned, and then we'll take it from here. That's basically what's going on. This is completely ridiculous. Brock Vandergrift's a little bit different. He was a former 5-star who he's trying to start. That's understandable. Daquan Finn is another great example of this, transferring from Toledo, and it makes perfect sense. You're probably not going to be a high draft pick. This is when you are in demand. You see that there's NIL potentially on the table if you go to a team like Maryland, a team like Mississippi State. Maybe Michigan is being floated out there as well. You're going to get a really good NIL deal, and that's what this is based off of. These are feeder schools, Toledo being a feeder school, even Oklahoma. Who would have thought? And if you're Dylan Gabriel, it does make sense. This is when you're going to be most wanted. You are one of the top QBs in the portal. By the way, I do not agree with these portal rankings at all. I have no clue why Dylan Gabriel would be ranked lower than Brock Vandagriff. If they're trying to say, well, because of eligibility, he only has 1 year left, I just don't understand how that makes sense. It's ridiculous. I think Dylan Gabriel is very underrated. Dylan Gabriel is rated the same as Kyle McCord. It just makes no sense. Now, Kyle McCord's transfer does make sense because Ryan Day basically told him you're going to have to fight it out. Will Rogers, transferring from Mississippi State possibly to Washington is a little different case as well. But in general, it's the idea. It's the circle of death. It's NIL. It's the extra year of eligibility. This is creating a really unhealthy ecosystem for college football. And I think Notre Dame is the best example where you're allowing, other teams. I mean, another example, I guess, could be Oregon, the whole Bo Nix situation. Now, you could also argue that Bo Nix going to Oregon, he wasn't wanted crazy. It wasn't like he put up great numbers at Auburn, but still, Oregon gets a transfer in Bo Nix, and now they're getting another transfer in Dillon Gabriel. Both of these quarterbacks have already started multiple years. Dillon Gabriel has started 4 years already. I just think it is ridiculous, and it's turning college football into something it was never meant to be. The idea of a transfer, that was something that was very rare. And now with the combination of immediate eligibility to where when you transfer one time, there's no penalty. You transfer again. If it's a grad transfer, there's no penalty in terms of that. I also think if a head coach leaves, you can transfer and get away with no penalty as well. So you could potentially actually transfer 3 different times if the right circumstances are at play and not face any penalty. This is free agency for college football. It's not what it was intended to be. And it's not even just me trying to be on a high horse morally. It's more so these smaller schools are never going to have a chance. Because if they have a star quarterback that they're trying to develop and they have a team, like let's say Boise State, for example, I think they're a good example to where they've come on as of late. They fire their head coach midseason. They galvanize around their interim. They end up winning their conference. They've got all this momentum going into next year. Their quarterback's only a sophomore. But oh yes, the NIL deal could be better at a Power 5 school. It's going to keep all these smaller schools down. And it is an issue in terms of the health of college football, in my opinion. A lot of this stuff is just such a clown show. I mean, recruiting in general at this point is a complete joke, but now it's spilling onto the actual rosters to where if you don't pay someone a certain amount of money, you could lose him to the transfer portal. So now, even if you win in a recruitment, in a year or two, that player's angry. He's not getting enough playing time. He could get a better NIL deal elsewhere. That could cause them to leave as well. So it really is free agency every year where you have to treat roster management. It's not this extreme, but still, with some of these players, you have to treat it like these guys are literally free agents because they can leave anytime they want. And I do think there's a good argument to make. Yes, they should be able to transfer based on what head coaches do, especially what we saw Brian Kelly do when Notre Dame technically still had a chance to make the playoff, and he still left for LSU before they were officially eliminated. That was a really, bad situation there. So it is understandable, but I'm just saying when it comes to all these players moving around versus coachings moving around, it's completely different because there's just so many more players. It affects college football in such a more drastic way than a head coach taking another coaching job. But either way, I just kind of want to talk about what I'm seeing from the transfer portal, how this is all developing, and all of the issues in relation to the extra year, being able to transfer multiple times without penalty if one of them is a grad transfer or if your head coach gets fired, along with NIL trickling into the transfer portal and really luring some of these good young players at smaller schools who are developing and are building smaller schools away to the big dogs, to where we're seeing some of these smaller college teams be developmental programs. And basically, you're going to see some of these teams just not want to take on new starting quarterbacks and deal with first-year bumps. I mean, we saw Ohio State and Alabama both have, young first-year quarterbacks. Alabama loses to Texas. Now they ended up making the playoff, but obviously there's a lot of people that are going to argue they shouldn't have made the playoff. And if they wouldn't have made the playoff, it would have been because they started a very young quarterback who made young mistakes against Texas. Jalen Milroe threw multiple interceptions in that game. He looked bad. He was a very young, inexperienced quarterback. Kyle McCord for Ohio State is another example. You look at Ohio State and that offensive talent, they could go basically every year and get a top transfer portal QB and not have to worry about the first year jitters at all, kind of like what Oregon is doing with a Dillon Gabriel or what Notre Dame is doing possibly in getting Riley Leonard and what they did with Sam Hartman. So that is the big issue. It's the idea of the smaller schools being feeder schools for the bigger schools. And the reason that's happening is because of immediate eligibility, because of NIL. These players at smaller schools realize they're not going to be NFL draft picks, or at least high NFL draft picks. This is where they can really make lucrative money through NIL deals, through putting their name out there and going to the highest bidder. It is a very interesting ecosystem when it comes to what's happening with college football right now. But either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you follow me on X. Link to that's always in the description.